Let's see where this goes, huh?
Why not?
Innovation. The process through which new products, concepts, services, methods, or techniques are developed, and insights from some of the most respected leaders that define it. Unedited and completely off the cuff. Hey, it's Fletch. I'm Vice President of Public Safety Solutions at 911 Inform. Welcome back for another episode of Off the Cuff Innovations. So today, the premise behind today's podcast was an old friend of mine from the way back days at Nortel. Remember those people? Who I used to collaborate with, who I used to argue with, who I used to have a great time with, but a real thought leader. And he's now an AI enthusiast and a regional CTO and a purple gray convert. For those of you who understand what that is, he's now been officially blessed as a violet slate. Matt Konwiser, my friend, how are you? And thank you for joining me. I've been wanting to do this for years, just waiting for the right topic to come up.
Absolutely, Mark. It's great to see you again, and it's great to be chatting with you. I'm doing really, really well, and I certainly hope you are also. And it's great to be here. I've been following all your activities in those circuits, and I've always been looking, like you said, for that perfect reason to start chatting, and here we are.
So why don't you give us a little context of what brought all this up? Because I was just out there being me, and you were out there being you, and paths converged.
Yeah. So basically, I work at IBM, and first of all, I just have to say I've got my AI shirt on here that you can't see very well, but everything we talk about here is my personal opinions and reflections. I'm not speaking on behalf of the company, but in my company, we do a ton of work with AI enhancing IVRs, enhancing call centers, and chatbots. And while there is a lot of AI that has nothing to do with chatbots, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. And we're seeing a lot of companies increasingly use chatbots to interact with humans. And so I started thinking, with all the work you did around Carey's Law and all the work you did for 911 in general and all the work around next generation, I started thinking, well, as organizations start to use generative AI and chatbots to front end more and more human interactions, what happens if a chatbot encounters a human in crisis or a human that needs some sort of support? What happens? Is there, how do we handle liability? How do we handle a chatbot's capability to identify that? And then how does a chatbot interact with either emergency services or the person that they're dealing with to make sure that that person who may need help can get it? And so it was purely a hypothetical kind of situation, but I threw it out on LinkedIn and I tagged you, Mark. Mark, you picked it up and reshared it, and then it kind of just took off. And there was a lot of very, very passionate responses, I think, to both of our threads. And it seemed like there's a lot of interest to have a conversation. So yeah, I figured let's do it. But that's the impetus for the whole thing, was really just as we start to see AI become more of a tier one or a front end between humans and business, what happens if there's a need for a live human to get some support, and how does it identify that, and what's the process, and where's the liability, and does it become something that gets incorporated to existing legislation, or is it uncharted territory? I mean, there's so many things we could talk about, but that's the genesis of it.
And what's really interesting is that this is totally uncharted territory. And, anything that we discuss today is going to be purely theoretical because as no matter how connected you or I are, we don't make law, we don't make policy. This is just an opportunity to have a good, straightforward, out in the open conversation about what I like to call the art of the possible. And that's really getting pretty radical with the introduction of AI capabilities. What's possible today was just dreams not 5 years ago.
That's right. Yeah, and that's what's so interesting, right? So if we do if we do a little bit of a short history lesson on what's happened and what's changed in 5 years, I've been working on AI easily for the past 12 years. And when we talk about AI,
You're not real, Matt. Come on. We've all known for years that there's a little cyborg going on inside there.
I mean, listen, we always have to get involved in everything, but I've spent a very long time working in cybersecurity prior to being more of an AI purist and an all things technology person. And then after our time at Nortel and Avaya, and in cybersecurity, we used AI for a lot of different things, but not the AI that we're seeing today. The AI that we saw before did a lot of really cool things. It could speak natural language, it could understand natural language, it could do a lot of insightful things for us. But we had to very specifically program that. And it would take months or years to train a system. And it was very resource intensive to do so, both in terms of human resources and compute resources. About 5 years ago, we started to see this generative AI notion come out. And what allowed generative AI to flourish is these new types of AI models. And I'm not going to get into the depths of it, but you've probably heard of transformer models. And if you haven't, just so we all know, it's the T in GPT. GPT is generative pre-trained transformer. So these transformer models can kind of learn on their own. So I was talking to somebody yesterday. I was actually talking to a barista yesterday about generative AI. And I was explaining what it is. And I basically said, we all know that 1 + 1 = 2. And because we know that, if somebody were to say, what's 16 plus 16, even if we don't have the answer off the top of our heads, we can reason that because 1 + 1 = 2, we can iterate until we figure out 16 plus 16. These generative models can do that, right? They're not human equivalent, right? So I'm not going there. But because they can kind of reason and figure things out from basic premise, you can now give them a dictionary, a series of literature, critical information about legislation, or even things like healthcare procedures, like how to perform CPR and a PDR, and a list of different symptoms and causes. And then you can ask this system questions, and it can use all that base knowledge to reason out the answers. And that's really what's become so popular in the past 5 years with generative AI, because now it doesn't take months and years of human intervention and training and teaching, and it doesn't take all these massive compute resources to get these systems functional to where they can actually provide service. And we can now replicate these pre-trained models to do lots of different things. So, for example, Fletch, I could say to a model that is commonly trained on current information, tell me about Carey's law. Or I could say, if I'm a business owner or a hotel owner, what do I need to do to make sure that I'm compliant with Carey's law? And that's all I need to say. And then it can go out and do the research and figure out all the elements and look at what state I'm in and then come back with an answer. So because of that, it's also made it a lot easier for people to talk to and interact with these systems. And that's why we're seeing them become much more prevalent as chatbots and as front ends, as human intervention in first line. That's also why we're seeing them used in a lot more different use cases and capability sets. So that's kind of how we got here. It didn't happen by magic. It happened through natural evolution of AI development and model development. And the capabilities are not, dilithium crystals and smoke and mirrors. It's very real. And it's all mathematics. It's all zeros and ones, just like it always has been, just in a whole new way.
To go
So
way, way back to a tagline, what do you want the internet to be?
oh my goodness, yeah. Uh,
Did that hurt? Did that spark a few neurons?
I actually found the old Come Together where we remember where we licensed the Beatles music for a
Yeah.
while and we did the commercials. Yeah, I mean, and
That
that
commercial is legendary, by the way.
it was. I mean, every time I saw it, I got goosebumps. It was a great buy, and it was a great commercial.
Here
So
come old flat top. Yeah. I'm gonna have to go Google that now. I gotta watch that.
It's out there. It still is.
No, I know. I know. I've seen it. It's great. So let's define what AI is. And I've been dying to talk to somebody like yourself who's an AI expert. What is the difference? What would you say the difference is between AI and just if then else or?
Yeah. So as good as AI models seem to be at interacting with humans, it is largely if then else or. It's just instead of being statically coded or requiring a human to sit over there and keep correcting it, it has some level of reasoning abilities to do that itself. Um, the way I've described it, and I've gotten a lot of AI peers very upset about this, but generative AI is the world's largest game of ad libs. Okay, that's literally how it works. You have a sentence or a fragment of a sentence with gaps, and the AI, through all of this knowledge that it's been given as base training, whether it's dictionaries or literature or law or anything else, takes all of that and it turns it into mathematical numbers, tokens. And then when you ask it a question with gaps, it uses its chain of tokens to try and fill in the blanks as best as it can. So it's really just saying, okay, well, if I'm asking Fletch about his blank hair, and I have a picture of Fletch, then I can probably look at the color and I could say it could be a color or it could be a length or it could be a style. But I'm going to look at the context of everything I've been trained in and say, most likely, this is the answer. And that's all it is. That's what generative AI does. So it really is the world's biggest game of if, then, or. It's just doing it in a very fast, very intelligent way with a high degree of what we say in the AI terms, confidence. Meaning I'm reasonably sure, given all the other examples of these types of conversations I've been given and the context of the two people talking now, that we're talking about a color. So the answer is blonde or red instead of long or short or curly or straight. And that's the answer. So that's what it is. It's not magic. It's just the people who wrote these things have done so with so many parameters and so much base training that it just happens to be really, really good at it. And that's it. So is that a good enough explanation, or do you want to go deeper?
No, that's an excellent explanation, and it's one that's generic enough to where I think you just made a lot of people understand what's underneath the covers of AI that really didn't know what was in the black box. So let me ask you this. I'm going to use this to kind of demystify a little bit AI. And we've got no agenda for today, which is probably going to be a little interesting, but I think a little cool. Explain hallucinations, because I find that fascinating.
Okay. So that's a great question. And I will say that I try my darndest to never use that term.
Okay.
There's two reasons for it. Number one, it's not technically correct. And number two, it helps anthropomorphize something that is not sentient.
Ooh, dictionary word.
Yeah, yeah. So, I'm sure you all know it. You've heard anthropomorphize all the time as it relates to AI, but it's basically giving it human traits when it's not human. A more correct term, and I'm not going to take credit for being the first person to say this, is confabulation. And it's the same thing. So when we say hallucination, we probably mean confabulation. And I'm going to give credit. I don't remember the authors, but there was actually an article written in I think it was an MIT magazine that had started using the term confabulation. And if you Google search that, you'll see there's a number of people out there on the internet that are claiming that that's a better representation of it. I wrote an article on LinkedIn about the same thing. So here's the answer. A hallucination or a confabulation, I'll explain why it's one and not the other in a second, is basically when an AI fabricates an answer to a question based on artificial or unreal backed information. So if I were to say, tell me about the Titanic, and it said, well, the Titanic was a spaceship that existed in 2299 and was destroyed by an alien race that I'm concerned about using a name for because it's probably copyright protected. And, you know, and it sunk outside of the former planet Pluto. All of those things in and of themselves are based on facts and data and training material. But that grouping of information is not correct. And you will not find any support for that information anywhere. Even though Pluto exists, the Titanic exists, it was in fact a ship. There are science fiction stories about aliens shooting down aircraft and spacecraft. I was just watching Star Blazers reruns, so I was thinking about Pluto. So that's kind of what a hallucination is. Now, the reason why that term is taken off because it's an easy one, but the reason why it's not is that a hallucination, by definition, is when the human brain creates something out of thin air with no basis in training or base data or memories or anything else. It's literally something net new. And an AI can't do that. A confabulation is the construction of multiple existing data points into something that is not real and has no basis in reality, but the elements of the story all have some sort of concrete track where you can say, okay, this is where this came from, right? So it's like analyzing a dream. If you have a dream about something, you'd be like, where did that come from? And then when you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, well, this came from there, and this came from there, and that came from there. So the story arc of the dream never actually happened, but you can understand where your brain got all of that from. And that's kind of what a confabulation is. And that's why I prefer that term for these hallucinations within AI, because when AI does produce one of these, it's not out of thin air. It is based on its training data, but it's creating something that just makes no sense at all. And that's what it is.
So when you have an AI tool, or even or a bot, I don't even know what you would call it. When you have an AI entity that's oh boy, should I even use that word entity? When you have an AI thing that's making decisions that potentially are life safety, you have to worry about confabulation.
Sure.
Obviously.
Yeah. And there's two things we have to worry about. There's confabulation and there's also drift. So drift is when an AI model starts out on the right path and then ends up going into a divergent area. So when you train it, it could in its first interactions produce completely correct information. And then over time, it starts to alter the path. And instead of keep producing the same stream of consciousness, correct information or chain of thought, it starts to produce something that's just a little bit to the right or a little bit to the left. So it's not confabulation, but it's not 100% on track either. So for example, you might be able to use an off-the-shelf medicine to treat a condition. But you might also use that off-the-shelf medicine to treat a different condition. And so you could start asking this AI model, if it's a medical one, how do you treat this particular patient? And they might say aspirin. And as you give this patient aspirin, it might start it might start processing and saying, okay, well, but this other condition can also be treated by aspirin. So maybe I'm not treating the same patient or treating in the same way, and then start looking at other associated treatments for the other condition and then start going down that alternate path. That can be dangerous, and so can confabulation, because if it is making up a condition or a treatment for a condition and makes that recommendation to a physician or a nurse practitioner or an EMT, then if the human doesn't fact check that, it could obviously create a crisis, even if one didn't previously exist. It could just be, hey, this person, fell down and broke their leg. We just need to put them in a splint and get them to the hospital. And then they could end up in something far more serious if the AI helps them misdiagnose an ancillary symptom as something far greater.
It sounds like you're having a heart attack. You need an electrocardio shock. Go get an extension cord and strip off the end.
Well, actually, it's funny you mentioned that because there was a famous case of an Amazon Alexa going rogue and suggesting to a little girl that she sticks something, I think a fork in an electrical outlet to have fun
Ooh.
on a rainy day. Now, here's why that happened, by the way. It happened because the AI, and this is all secondhand. I'm hearing this from the articles I've read, and there's a doctor, a colleague that I'm created a nice relationship with. She's a professor in London. She actually wrote a whole paper on the impact of AI in children, and this was one of the examples that she used. But effectively, what had happened was the girl said, "Hey, Alexa, what can I do on a rainy day?" And there was a TikTok trend or some sort of social media trend. I don't remember if it was TikTok or not now, but it had to do with like sticking things in outlets. So the Alexa was like, "Hey, okay, this is a trend. This is trending. Everybody seems to be doing this. So this is what I'm going to tell you you should do." It's not that it knew it was dangerous and it didn't really think about whether it was or not. It just looked at trends and said, "This is a trend. So here's an activity." And the parent was home, as I understand it. The parent was home, heard this, intercepted it. Nobody got hurt. Nobody was even at risk because there was a very watchful, appropriate parent involved. But that's one of those examples. So when you said, "Hey, somebody needs a nice little cardiac shock here, just strip this electrical cord," that was the first thing that jumped into my head.
So how do we protect against that and retrain or train away from those danger areas? Is that something that's even possible? Because there are so many variables.
Yeah. So it is theoretically possible, right? So for example, there's this concept of training called chain of thought. And chain of thought is the same thing as like critical thinking questions. So if you were to ask a child what trends on TikTok might be, they might do some research or they might say, "Oh yeah, everybody's sticking things in electrical outlets." Then you could say to the child, "Well, what would happen if you put a metal object in electricity?" And they'd say, "Oh, well, the metal object will conduct electricity." I say, "Okay, well, what would happen if somebody were to touch their house electricity line? Would that hurt them?" And then they would say, "Yes, you'd get hurt. That's why you're not supposed to ever do that." And you say, "Okay, well, what would happen if you took something metal that you just said could conduct electricity and a person were to hold that metal thing and then put it near house electricity? What would happen?" "Oh, well, they would get shocked. They could get really hurt." Right. So your first question or your first answer was, "Oh, well, sticking things in outlets." Would you do that? No, I wouldn't do that. That would be dangerous because of all these things you just led me to realize. So, if you can apply this chain of thought training and reasoning to these models, and that's what we'll say models instead of entities, by the way. So, if you were to apply this to these models, theoretically, they would come to the realization that that suggestion is just fundamentally a horrible idea. And so they shouldn't recommend it again. But here's where things get complicated, and there's always a complication. The more broadly trained a model is, so if you were to give a model all the general knowledge of the internet and then give them access to the internet to continue to find new information, the harder it becomes to put a cork in all of these holes in the dam because they know so much and there's only so few people that can be there to chain of thought reason them out of suggesting bad things. And so it gets to a
Because
point,
that still takes a person to say, this is bad.
right? Because the model is going to base its information off of what it's been given as a source of material.
So
And
let me stop you right there.
Mhm.
So at what point does reasoning become thinking, or does it ever?
So this is where it gets interesting. So there was this really cool report that started to differentiate the notion of thinking versus the notion of intelligence. So I think the jury's still out a little bit on that. It's not this industry definition, it's just mine. But when I think of intelligence, intelligence is the ability to reason. Thinking is a little bit different. So these newer models have intelligence. So if you look at like ChatGPT.
Ooh, wait a minute. Let me clarify. You're saying the new models have intelligence.
Intelligence, yes. Now, not sentience and not thinking, but
Okay.
intelligence. So here's the difference. Intelligence is the ability to reason. It's the ability to take pieces of information that are disconnected and put them together and formulate something. And there's a way that it does that. So the example nowadays is ChatGPT 1.0. Now 1.0 is actually 4.0 with another model that sits in front of it. It's what we would, the way I would describe it is kind of agentic AI. So there's another model that acts as an agent of the primary one that helps feed it and acts as the front line to people. So it'd be like working with a translator. So if I don't understand much about 911, not nearly as much as you do, Mark, but you understand me and you understand 911. So if you had a core 911 expert and PSAP system behind you, and I wanted to ask questions that I'm not really asking in context to the way the system works, I can ask you. And you'll do your own intelligent processing and figure out the types of questions you need to ask the PSAP expert so that I can get the answers I need. And that kind of intermediary that has its own logic is kind of how this 1.0 system works, as I understand it. I'm going to give you that big, I'm not an insider, I don't know for sure, I'm going off of what I've read in my own interactions with it, but that's kind of how it works. And because of that, it demonstrates intelligence, because you can ask it a riddle, for example. And I tested this. I asked it a number of riddles as soon as I got early access to it. And where the previous model couldn't answer the questions and couldn't ask me questions about it, the new model answered them all. And it did that because it intercepted the questions, it took them apart, it figured out how to formulate them into a series of questions, it fed them into the core model, then took the answers back and formulated it into a response. And so that reasoning as a unit of models is some degree of intelligence. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because AI, the I in AI, is intelligence. But it's not necessarily going to sit there and have free thought. It's not going to sit there before I ask it or after I ask it and start to formulate, oh, that was a cool riddle, I wonder if I can come up with one on my own. It still has to be told to do that. And so that's where I would separate the concept of thought versus intelligence. Again, that's just my layperson's way of describing it, so that we don't get too deep into the weeds of mathematics and advanced calculus and time series data and everything else. That's just the way I'm explaining it, and I understand it.
I think that's a great explanation, and it totally makes sense. And it kind of brings us to the point. One point that I wanted to bring up is that artificial intelligence doesn't have to be in control of a process. I like to call it assistive intelligence, right? It's just like having a calculator or using TurboTax to help you with your taxes, right? It's not cheating. It's doing the math for you. And that, I think, is the initial step into some situations like, should I have AI answer my 911 calls? Because that mechanism as it exists today, terribly understaffed, terribly underpaid, and terribly overloaded. So exactly what AI was designed to assist with. But again, you're dealing with 911, you're dealing with personal safety. Where do you start drawing the line? I think that's a valid conversation, but that's not part of the should I have AI help with 911 in certain circumstances with certain parameters. And I think there's a valid reason to utilize that for basic decision-making assistance.
Yeah, and that's, I agree with that, right? I think that I'm not opposed to AI as much as a lot of my writing might imply a tale of caution. I am a big fan of governance. because governance around AI, Fletch, is how we limit or prevent a lot of the concerns that you just asked me about, right? How do you sit there and chain of thought reason a model out of all the potential dangers that it learns about without realizing they're dangers in the first place? Well, governance is a great start, because if you regulate what goes into it, then it can't make things up. It can't confabulate because it doesn't have the core data. So I'll give you an example of ways I think it could be very helpful in emergency services. You can't necessarily expect an emergency services worker to speak every language of every person that they could come across. And these models can be trained in many, many languages in terms of listening and transcribing, in terms of real-time transcription of typed messages, and the ability to produce foreign language messages or alternate language messages. So I'll give you a great example. I needed to create a message in Turkish that was colloquial, that was based on a very specific event in somebody's life, a positive event, a wedding. And I don't know any Turkish. So I just simply asked the model, I said, first of all, do you speak Turkish? Yes, absolutely. Fully trained in Turkish. Great. Do you understand Turkish customs and weddings? Yes, I absolutely do. Give me a not too familiar, but very warm, expressive way to congratulate somebody on getting married. And it produced something in Turkish and gave me the English translation. I wrote it down on a card, and when I gave it to the person who received it, they lit up and they're like, "Wow, you even got the accent marks correct." Now, I didn't tell them that I used a model, although if they see this, they'll know. But those types of services can be really invaluable, because if you know a little bit of a language but not a lot of it, and somebody's in pain or in distress and they're speaking quickly or in a thicker accent in a native tongue, you may misunderstand a body part, a degree of pain, or a symptom. And these models can help make sure that those misunderstandings are limited. Now, again, as with a human, there's always a chance for error. But there's a greater degree of probability that a model will be able to understand and real-time translate a language than a human being able to understand and real-time translate any language. So that's a great example. So the other ones, like we talked about, like symptom checkers, back checking, but I'll give you another one. In the event of a mass emergency, like a hurricane, road outages, power outages, other things. If the model has the ability to intercept and understand real-time traffic updates, weather updates, road closures, emergency notifications, and messages, it could theoretically help an emergency response crew navigate to get to a destination to provide care more quickly by avoiding areas that are already reported as having trees down, having electrical outages, having power failures, accidents, whatever they may be. We've been using AI to do navigation for a decade or more. So just simply adding additional context to that and helping people get to their people that need the support more quickly could be an interesting application as well. So aside from the obvious, there's a lot of other benefits that could go with this from emergency response. And those are just some of the things that jumped in off the top of my head.
So I'll tell you a really quick story. You'll get a kick out of this. You've met my daughter. When she was very young, this was so long ago, I actually had a BlackBerry. And I had a GPS puck that plugged into the BlackBerry that had some limited navigation app on it. We're driving from my house here in North Jersey, and we're going up to Vermont, somewhere near the Vermont Teddy Bear Company. And it's navigating me through the back roads of New York State and over into Vermont and New England. About a 3-hour drive. Gets me there, and we're coming up on the place, and the GPS says your destination is a half a mile ahead on the left. And we get up the road a half a mile, and there's our hotel on the right. And from the back seat, my little 6-year-old Haley Marie pipes up, "That thing sucks." Just brought us 3.5 hours through the back roads of New England and got us here. And it had the wrong side of the street. Sorry that the database was not correct, but again, just a little bit of context for you.
No,
I
it's a
thought
good.
you'd appreciate that.
So let me ask you something, Fletch. I mean, where do you think these types of generative models might have a strong case in a PSAP or with emergency responders?
So I think that there is a lot of opportunity to, number one, offload information or offload call events into the PSAP, because 911 centers are historically limited. You know, the average 80% of the 911 centers that are out there are probably less than 6 seats if fully staffed. And there's a staffing crisis. So you might have 4. That's 4 simultaneous calls that a center could take, because you don't put people on hold. So what happens is the call rolls over, the call goes into queue, calls end up stacking up and not being addressed. With everybody carrying a cell phone, you have one motor vehicle accident on a highway, you've got 30 people or more calling that in. That could cause the 911 call to roll over 3 or 4 towns away, which, great, they can answer the call. They can't do anything with it. They can't dispatch the appropriate resources. All they can do is take a message and call the center that should have gotten the call, which is already overloaded because they're getting too many calls. So it's the endless loop, right? AI could take the information from the network and say, okay, Matt's calling 911. Matt's on a mobile phone. The coordinates of where Matt is in very close proximity to a known motor vehicle accident that I already know about. Hi, Matt. I'm the 911 IVR AI tool. Seems like you're in close proximity to a known motor vehicle accident. Is that why you're calling? Yes, it is. Great. Do you have anything that you think might really be relevant? Because we're on scene, we're on the way. Here's all we know, everything we know about it, of what's going on. Do you have anything that's relevant to add to that? No, you pretty much have everything I was going to let you know about. Or, yeah, you know what? Did you know the thing just exploded and is on fire? Oh, yeah, well, that's relevant. Now I can deal with you appropriately or put you on the list to call back just to double check if that's what I decide to do. I can take some other action other than rolling your call over to another center that can't help you at all. That's a huge benefit by providing you with information and offloading. I see that gathering information and data about an event can provide more context to a 911 call taker to where they could start cherry picking. I see something in the profile or by your device settings that you speak Mandarin. Okay, I don't speak Mandarin. So I'm going to institute an AI tool that's going to real time translate your Mandarin into English, and it's going to real time translate my English into Mandarin, and we can have an almost real time conversation in our native languages and not even worry about who speaks what and when. Those are the tools that I think can really turn on some real differences in 911 centers that don't exist today, but every call taker would dream about, because I don't have time to call language line, identify that you're Mandarin or one of the other 1,000 dialects in the Asian language, and work on getting the right translator at language line, which is a paid service that A, is costing me money, and B, is going to take 35 to 40 seconds to get somebody on the line. It's going to do some translation, but nowhere near real time. Those are the benefits, just off the top of my head, that AI, or assisted intelligence, as I like to call it, is going to have an immediate, instantaneous impact on public safety and save lives.
I like that.
And none of that, from my perspective, from my view, none of that is outside of the realm of possibility that you or anybody else could start building tomorrow and probably have implemented in a couple of days.
So I think that's probably true. I'm curious now, because I thought of something else as you were talking about this, the overflow situations and the handling of the calls. Are there ever like surge staffing at PSAPs, for example? Like there may be certain times of the year or during an imminent natural disaster, like a hurricane that's coming in. Do they increase their staffing on the fly to accommodate what they expect to be a larger volume of potential 911 calls, and then shrink it down? And if so, I wonder if there might be an application to help further train and enable these more temporary people by using a generative model to make sure that they're following an appropriate process and learning all the right procedures instead of having to be trained by a human or a book. I don't know. I don't know enough about it, but I'll throw it out there.
Yeah, so what centers will do, they always build a center for many more seats than they actually staff, right? And that could be double, anywhere from 50% more to even double, right? Just to handle surge event type things. And if they know something is happening, they'll bring more people in. They'll put people on standby that can get in quickly. With unified communications advancements that have happened over the last decade that you and I have been dealing with, 911 centers are starting to adapt Go kits to where they'll pack a Gorilla box with a VPN router and an IP phone and a secure laptop. And I know you're smiling because we built this crap 15, 20 years ago.
That's exactly why I'm smiling.
So, the phone was purple and it was called MCS, but, whatever. Another great idea. What happened to that stuff? But, that's another topic altogether. But yeah, they're effectively building that. And where it really came out and in use was during COVID. So they could bring on extra staff without bringing people inside the same four walls and infecting the only people that can help. And these are trained people. There are certain models that are coming out now, like 988, the National Crisis Lifeline or Suicide Hotline, if you will. That's actually contracted by a company called Vibrant, and they manage all the centers and their individual people. Again, less strict training on 911 procedures, but more training on mental health and wellness. They're staffed for that. And those people are, much more prevalent to bring on in that remote type environment. So yeah, a lot of use cases where people can dynamically be brought in on the fly. I like the training model because there's one application that you can research called Corti, CORTI. That's probably one that is actually building a training model for PSAPs that has had some pretty good success over the last couple of years as they've fine-tuned their AI model. I've sat down and at a trade show and went in and became a 911 dispatcher for Corti. Now, a little bit of experience, very old experience, nothing with new policies as far as practical. I think I did okay for what it was, but holy crap, it was pretty realistic. Yeah, there were things where I knew it was an AI tool, but there were still things where I almost got lost in it for a little bit. So I think building out that model has got significant capabilities for training, for getting casual staff ready for that, and expanding out those environments. A lot of opportunities.
So I had a little fun, Mark, as you were talking. I have a model interface up right now, and so I asked it. I said, "What is Cordy?" And it immediately came back and said it is an AI-powered assistant primarily for healthcare professionals. It listens to patient consults, to transcribes conversations, and provides actionable insights. And then the last line, I won't read the whole thing, but it says Cordy is also expanding into public safety, providing AI support for call takers and dispatchers and emergency services to improve accuracy and speed of response. So the interesting thing here is, by the way, that it was actually able to understand the context, right? Because I said Cordy all capitals because I assumed it was an acronym. Uh,
Actually, it's not, but that's interesting.
oh, it's
Okay.
not. Okay. Well,
No, I don't believe it is. But go ahead.
it found it right away. But I was going to ask, just for fun, because we were talking about the training and enablement, is there a question you can think of that a newly trained PSAP worker might need to answer in order to pass a certification or be ready for work? Because I'm curious, if I were to ask this model that question, if it would get it right.
Ooh, wow. So the premise of this podcast here is to tease all of the experts that replied to our thread. And let me tell you, you talk about the powerhouses of public safety and AI, the people that we sparked a response from shocked the crap out of me because these people don't normally comment on stuff. They have an opinion, but very rarely do they publicly comment. I was shocked at the context. So we'll save that question for when we do a larger live cast, which is the intention behind this. And then we can have some fun. You know, what do you, by the way, I was going to use the word Googling that, but that's not correct. What do you use? What's the verb for what you did? Is there?
Prompted. I mean,
Prompted.
you just
Okay.
prompted, yeah. Now there are some models that are generally trained and internet searchable that are now starting to advertise search capabilities, internet search. So kind of the new Google, as it were. And it'll be interesting to see how they manifest, because one of the other big things that these models can do is summarization, right? So I had a friend who was in New York to see the performance Sleep No More. I don't know if you heard about that. I believe it is No More, by the way, no pun intended. I think its last performance was earlier this year. And it was based on, if I remember correctly, I think Shakespeare's Hamlet was what the whole interactive experience of Sleep No More is based on. And neither he nor I could remember what Hamlet was about. So I pulled up a model and I said, explain Hamlet in 2 paragraphs. And it gave me the whole thing. And then I was like, So I said, explain Hamlet in 1 sentence, then in 5 words, then in 1 word. And it just kept getting more and more succinct. And we were enjoying playing with it a little bit and forcing it to take a very complicated plot line and summarize it in a word or 5 words. But the summarization is a great capability set, not to necessarily replace. You remember the yellow and black cliff notes that used to sit on the bookstores?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, like, who didn't? But the issue with drift or confabulation when it's doing summarization is very real, because you're asking the model to make a decision on what is most relevant in the text that it is absorbing and attempting to summarize. So when you're using it to search the internet, instead of straight up Google that's just keyword matching and returning results with a little bit of machine learning in there to make it better. A generative model could theoretically provide much better, much more contextual search results, but it could also create much wilder results because it could confabulate or it could drift from the original intent of the search query. And you'd have to be quite savvy in what you're looking for to understand if what it produced is valid or not. Again, not trying to be a naysayer. But this could be a very real consideration if you're using generative AI models as your primary method of searching for things. Is that summarization skill that it has could either significantly help you or it could potentially hinder you.
So I use the ChatGPT 4o, and that's the small letter O for those who don't know. That's the engine that I use regularly. And you know what? That's almost replaced Google for me because of its summative capabilities. And what really, the thing that really turned me on to, and again, it's trust but verify, because it'll start hallucinating once in a while. What really got me convinced about these large language models was when I asked it to write an obituary for me and include something about my daughter. Didn't say who my daughter was, but that almost made me cry with what it came back with. The detail that it came back with got my daughter's name correct and pulled up an incident that was probably the most obscure thing that you could ever think of, which was, it was a reference in an introduction, not even an introduction, it was a reference by an FCC official in a speech that they gave at the Illinois Institute of Technology like 8 years ago, where the commissioner, the chairman, jokingly labeled me as a troublemaker one day for my work on Kerry's Law, meant as a compliment, but, just taking how I am, and he said, "Oh, and I see the troublemaker Mark Fletcher is here today, present," and everybody got a laugh. Even referenced that obscure thing, which is, as far as I know, documented in one spot that's in public record, which is the transcript of that federal proceeding, but found that. And that was like, wow, talk about large language models. And that's what convinced me. If that knew that and could write a heartwarming, obituary for me, referencing personal things about my daughter and finding out who she was, this, you know what, for the research I want to do, I'm sold.
Mm-hmm. Well, so some of that is a kind of a self-fulfilling outcome, right? So I'll give you an example. The accounts that I have on these public models, I don't use my primary email addresses. I don't use my full name. I actually use an alias and a kind of a trash bin account, so that it doesn't know my first name and last name. It doesn't know anything about me. And I even have the pre-prompt parameters set up to make me chaotically neutral in all things, so it doesn't try and slant an opinion one way or another. So I think there's two things to be interesting there, right? So
Are you still AIstud@hotmail.com?
Yeah, I'm sure that's probably taken long before
Yeah, it probably is. And now they're going to get a lot of email. Who the hell is Fletcher and Konwiser?
So I very intentionally try and remain somewhat anonymous there for those reasons, right? But the other important thing is, it's a great lesson to remember that what goes on the internet stays on the internet, right? Like, I mean, if it's out there, it is searchable. It's just a matter of whether you have the tenacity and the time to find this stuff. And with these models that are super massive and have tremendous web crawling capacity, um, it is it's nearly limitless reach. So if you've posted it and you published it and you've linked it to yourself in some way, shape, or form through text or affiliations through LinkedIn or Facebook or anything else, it can potentially find that. So going back to the governance thing, how you have your privacy settings on these different social media sites, the pictures you upload, the references you make to friends or family, and all that context. With generative models being able to search and understand all of that, you no longer need to worry about whether there's a person sitting at a desk willing to put enough effort into you to find out everything about you. They can ask a model and a model can do it.
So let me ask you a question, because I'm really stupid from an AI perspective. I have a paid version of ChatGPT 4.0. Been using it for probably a year. I find it very useful in writing blogs to create an outline, to make sure, I ask it to make sure I include all the topics. I give it my blogs and ask it to comment on readability and understandability, which it makes suggestions, which it does really well. What I find interesting, the more I use it, the more it puts things in my voice, or it appears to be doing that. Am I hallucinating that, or what's happening?
No, I mean, so the models have what's called a memory. They recall interactions and they understand preferences. So the nature of them is very specifically designed to get better over time. That's the other big difference. So going back to the example I used of the older models that took years to build and were giant monolithic platforms, these systems are designed to get better with human interaction, and they are designed to learn from those interactions to ultimately improve and do better for the next one. And that's you're seeing that. So some of it may be a little bit of a hallucination, in that you have to remember, as much as the model is going to meet you halfway, if you accept the model's suggestions with everything you submit, you're going to remember those and you're going to write closer to that style for the next one, so that it's better aligned with what the model would say is a good product. And so it's going to have fewer corrections, and it's going to create things that are more in line with the samples that you've already given it.
So we train each other then, so to speak.
What's that?
We train each other
Yeah.
to some degree.
Sure. Yeah. Now, funny thing, and this goes back to my photography hobby as well. So I had a mentor in photography who was a photojournalism professor at NC State. And what this photojournalism professor taught me is that you should never, ever, ever use Photoshop. That if you do, you use it only to make minor touch-ups. So like, for example, if there's like a spot on the sensor and you want to remove that, you can do that. But you can't take a blue sky and turn it into a red sky. You can't remove a telephone pole or a wire. You can't take a great photo of a bird and change the background. So instead of flying in front of a house, it's flying in front of a reservoir, because you are altering the content. You're not keeping it true to what the camera saw. And so I've always shot that way. So all the photographs I take are completely unretouched. If the camera didn't see it, I didn't take it, and I'm not going to create it out of nothing. I do the same thing with all of my writing. I don't use an AI to screen, review, or suggest anything. And as a result of that, I'm sure it's not as good as it could be. I'm sure there's a million mistakes and a million things that I could do to make it better, but I don't have to worry about ever being influenced by it, because I'm never using it. And I'm not interested in conveying a message that is to the point. I'm interested in conveying a message that's personal and me, that reflects my crazy brain and harebrained schemes. And that's it. And I, by the way, I have typos and grammatical errors and sentence structure problems and a million other things. And sometimes I'll read something a week later and be like, oh God, that's terrible, and then go back and edit it. but that's just the way it is. As a matter of fact, my email signature, my work email signature, aside from the standard, salutations and greetings, it says, note, this email was written entirely by a human. And I actually have that in my signature line so that people know if they get a note from me, right, wrong, or indifferent, it's all me. It's straight out of my brain. So it's not I have no objection to using it for help, but I don't ever want it to learn me necessarily. And I don't want, um, I don't want to learn from it. I don't want to be swayed in my writing styles by something that it does, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. And I think for me, and again, everybody's got a personal opinion. So I'm going to disagree with you a little bit for myself. I think it's improved my grammar. I think it's improved my spelling. I think because I'm horrible. I'm a horrible typist. I'm a horrible misspeller, and I ain't got no good English. So when I'm writing something that I want to convey a point across with, it's important to me to make sure that it still sounds like me, but I'm not taking something and having someone go, "What a flippin' idiot." I'm not going to listen to anything this guy says.
So
So I try to find a happy medium there. And I try to use it to better myself, and it has improved my writing. And I won't always take every suggestion. I mean, sometimes it's just it's got something wrong because it's out of context, but I find it very useful for creating an outline. I'll give it a context that I can vocalize, and then from that, it'll distill a list. Cover this, cover this, cover this, cover this. And I'm like, oh, okay, there's 10 things. I'll take these 7 because this is in line with what I want to say. So I let it assist me. I don't let it dictate what I do.
Mhm.
I think I found a happy medium
It
that
sounds
I
like
feel comfortable with.
and you may have convinced me to try it out. I mean, here's my thing, right? I've got enough of a body of work now where I could take a model and give it enough of a sample so that it's not looking at one thing and trying to rewrite, but it's looking at a body of work and then helping me keep my voice. So instead of kind of like what your example was, where it's training you, you're training it, I'm just going to train it on my body, and then I'm going to expect it to return the favor and give me suggestions and edits that don't disrupt what is my way of communicating in my own style. It's the
So I think we both have different ways of training our AIs, but they're both satisfactory, giving us the results that we want. And
yes,
that's okay, right? As long as I'm getting the output that I'm happy with, that's
yeah.
great.
Now, what I do use AI for frequently is image generation because
Oh, yeah.
I mean, photography, I'm passable. Illustration, I'm atrocious. Uh, and I'm going to give a little shout out. I know somebody who is an absolutely phenomenal illustrator, and she has inspired me. So her name is Elise Burdett, and she doesn't do it for money. She's just an amazing illustrator and freehand artist. And the stuff that she comes out with, like I could only dream of. And so I use AI to generate my Elise isms so that I can put an image to an article or to a thought,
Yeah.
and then I provide the writing. Now, the um, the interesting thing there, by the way, and this is a purely AI conversation, has nothing to do with 911, but there's a lot of copyright and trademark issues with using AI for things. So, for example, the USPTO will not issue or enforce copyright or trademark on anything that an AI helps to generate or generates. It's not protectable because it was not created by a human being. So
What if it's modified by a human being, though?
it depends. There's gray areas on it. There's percentages and there's content rules. But typically speaking, the safest way to do it is just not have an AI touch it. And there's been famous cases, by the way, of literary awards being revoked and controversial, decisions being called into question because AIs were used in the editing or making of content. So none of the images I create and post and publish are protectable. But here's where it gets interesting. The prompts potentially are,
Ah,
because the prompt was written entirely by me without the help of an AI. The image was generated by an AI because of the prompt. So while the image may not be, the prompt might be. So I could take that prompt and I could use it in 6 different image generators, produce 6 different versions of the same image from the same core prompt, and that prompt is still protected, but the images that those 6 different generators create are not. It's a very weird gray area thing, and it is an ongoing discussion and debate. Other interesting thing, Fletch, is HTML code is not copyrightable. And the reason why is because the ruling, according to the USPTO, at least the one I read that was just out in the past year, said that because there are so many tools that can be used to generate the code. So you create the blank space web page, you position the images and write the text, and then when you click save, the program generates the HTML backend code. Because of that, it can't be protected. Because you didn't write the source code, the app did, even if you created the layouts that generated the code itself. So if I were to think that through a little bit, I might say that even if you created most of the base content and concept, but the AI generated the final product, that may not be protectable. I don't know, but if I were to use the HTML example and extrapolate on it, I'd say maybe it's not. Can't tell.
well, that's interesting because I'll typically write my blog, and then I'll feed my blog into the AI tool, and I say generate a graphic image that's representative of this blog, and then I'll take that back and I'll go through a couple of iterations, and I'll make modifications. I'll throw the modified image back in and say improve upon this or add this, and then, maybe 4 or 5 iterations later, I'll have what I want. Sometimes I get it early, sometimes it takes a little bit. I always have to go back and correct the spelling of anything that's text
Mhm.
because it never gets that right, at least from what I've seen. And but again, it's a tool. It's no different to me. It's no different than saying, what's the sum of these two numbers, and me using a calculator to achieve that, or doing longhand math.
Yeah.
It's
And
a tool.
that is the best way to look at it, right? It is a tool because it's not the only tool, right? There's a lot of things you can do. So even popular word processors have spell check and thesaurus and grammar suggestions, right?
Example I use all the time.
So yeah, if you use that and publish something, it's fully protectable because the AI didn't write it.
What
Um,
about Grammarly?
I don't know. I mean, I would think Grammarly, again, it's not proposing full sentence rewrites and summarization, right? It's
Sometimes it is.
Well, then I don't know. I don't know how Grammarly would fit in
It
a.
does for me because I'm so bad at grammar.
Actually,
Rewrite this paragraph to say this.
believe it or not, I actually know an attorney I can ask because I did a panel in Philly recently with a patent and trademark attorney who specializes in AI type stuff, and he and I were talking about a lot of things, but we didn't bring up Grammarly. That could be an interesting middle ground. But I think it's not, because Grammarly is not. I don't think it's generative. I think it's machine learning. I think it's predictive, if I remember correctly. But I don't know. That is a good open question. Maybe we'll answer that when we also talk about asking it PSAP training questions on the next session.
So I think we've done a great job of laying out a framework for at least starting to lay out a framework for a very, very complex topic. I'm not sure we could cover everything we wanted to if this went on for 3 hours. Um, but getting back to the core piece of this, should AI or can AI be used in public safety environments? And if yes, which environments and to what extent? You want to add on to that? Because I want people to think about this.
Yeah. So here's going back to my question, and this is kind of what started the whole thing. If you have a company that uses a chatbot for HR and to find help and resources, if you have a chatbot that front ends a healthcare portal, if you have a chatbot that front ends any type of professional services portals, whether it's mental health services, medical care, insurance, anything. And this goes back to what we talked about on the phone. If I were to call my doctor's office, the very first thing I hear is, if this is an emergency, hang up and call 911.
Mm-hmm.
Then you hear the IVR calling tree, right? I haven't seen that in chatbots. So is that something that needs to be added? Is that something that needs to be legislatively added, right? And then here's the other question. Because chatbots can understand sentiment and emotion and tone, they could potentially pick up from the writing style or speaking style if they're listening via microphone, that somebody could be in crisis. They could be having a stroke based on speech patterns. They could be having a mental crisis. They could be experiencing some other emergency where the way they're forming their sentences implies that they're in pain or in some sort of physical distress. If the chatbot has the ability to detect that, what happens? What's the responsibility of the makers of the chatbot, of the company that's hosting it, of the individual that's interacting with it? Can it be helpful, or can it cause lag or latency in the ability to get somebody help that they desperately need? And that's kind of what started this whole thing. So we've talked about this whole call, this whole session, all the origins and all the issues and how it works and what it does and how it does it. So we certainly know it can do a lot of these things, but now in the context of emergency services and 911, how do we then make it help people if it's a first line of contact for so many different types of resources now? That's kind of where I'm left off.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to do a pre-recorded version of this to set the ground rules, or not the ground rules, but just set the basic premise of what AI is, what it can do, how it does it, so people can start making intelligent prompts for the next version.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so new, right? And like I say, there's no experts here. I mean, I did some research. I checked the news and I read the journals daily. And I made a note to myself that from between Friday, what was Friday, the 26th, I think, between Friday the 26th and Monday the 29th, there were 12 new papers published on generative AI. 6 of them introduced new models and new model training techniques that had never been seen before. A few of them talked about different legislation and changes. One of them introduced a new weakness in models for generating backwards instead of forwards. And that's just over a 3-day window, right? So because there's no experts in this, and because the science is so new and it's evolving so rapidly, by the time we have a live call, there could be 10 new data points that we didn't have by the time this call airs, right? So it's really just all interesting conversations and what ifs about the future. And that's what this should be. It should not be a point in time statement in an education session that says, okay, now I know everything there is to know. It should be, okay, here's, to your point, all the things to think about for the next time. And that's what I love so much about why you set this up this way.
Now that's really interesting. I'm really looking forward to furthering this conversation because I think it needs to be had. You know, I'm surprised it hasn't been had. I don't know if people are afraid, if it's just too new, if the right experts in the right fields just aren't willing. I don't know, but I'm glad you tagged me in a post. I'm glad I saw it, and I'm glad I responded because, like I said, you've been on my bucket list for a while to do something like this. I've been just waiting for the right thing, and our paths dynamically crossed here, which is pretty cool. And
Yeah.
generative AI had nothing to do with it other than being the topic.
Absolutely not. And I, Mark, like I said, I feel the exact same way. I'm really glad we connected, and this is a great conversation. I definitely look forward to the next one.
Yep. So, well, here's to the good old days where we drove around gold Tauruses.
I still have my red BMW Matchbox car that said Nortel Networks on the hood that they gave out as a promo for when they
Here come old Flat Top.
That's great.
I'm going to, I wonder if there'd be a copyright infringement if I include that video.
I don't know. I mean, you could probably include a link to it. It's on YouTube, right?
Yeah, I think I'm going to do that. It's a great commercial.
That is.
A classic. All right, my friend, listen, thank you very much. Always great to talk to you, but talking to you in this context has been extra special for me. And we'll get this out and posted ASAP, and we'll see what interest it garnishes up, and we'll get together a live cast of this where we can get a lot of opinions from a lot of people that I know have opinions. I know some opinionated people.
I don't doubt it. I know you, so I'm excited to see who shows up, and we'll have a great time with it.
All right, my friend. Listen, have a great day. Stay well.
Thanks, Martin.
Today, Nortel Networks is changing the way businesses communicate.
Here come old Flat Top.
He come grooving up slowly.
He got juju eyeball.
He won holy roller.
He got hair down to his knee. Got to be a joker.
He just do what he please. He wear no shoe shine. He got toe jam football. He got monkey finger.
He say, I know you. You know me. One thing I can tell you is you
Got to be free.
come together right now.
Bringing it all together with the true power of the internet.
Come together
Nortel Networks,
right now
how the world shares ideas.
over me.